This week we are moving on to soup, and what better soup to start with than a simple French onion soup. French onion soup is a broth-based soup or a clear soup, depending on which set of notes I decide to use for class. Basically what this means is it's a soup you can see through. And if you've had French onion soup before, you know it's pretty much just a brown broth with cooked onions. The best part about French onion soup is it's served with a crouton or a large piece of bread with melted cheese that, if you have the right bowl, can be baked right on top in the oven, and it's absolutely delicious. Okay, so we're starting with half a cup of butter and 2 tablespoons of olive oil in a large soup pan. Okay, this is actually trying to remember, I think it's a 6-quart stock pot. Okay. So olive oil is actually going to raise the burning point of the butter, and that'll help our butter not turn brown as the onions cook in it. Alright, so we're over medium heat. What we're going to do is we're going to add about 4 cups of thinly sliced onion. I like to cut them really thin in the half circles. Some people leave them around, some people chop them up. I like half circles. You get a little bit of the prettiness that comes with the round slice of onion, like the onion ring, but it's a little easier to eat. So at this point, what I'm going to do is stir these onions until they cook down and they are translucent. Okay, I don't want them browning. Browning can make them a little bitter. So I'm going to monitor my heat. I don't want to burn my butter. I don't want to burn my onions. So soup is kind of a fun food to eat. You can put a variety of different things in your soup. So all soup is in a broth, whether it be broth-based, such as beef or pork, chicken, even lobster or shrimp. You can have a fish broth. You can also use a milk-based broth. You can use a combination of both. Okay, do you see that little yellow bit? That is going to drive me insane. That is a paper that got in there somehow. As careful as I tried to be. So we'll take that out. If we were in the classroom, you'd know that's one of my pet peeves. Anyway, back to soup. So it is a time saver. It is one of those things that once you get it put together, you can let it cook. It cooks well in a crock pot, in the Instant Pot, on the stove. You can do a thin broth, a thick broth. You can use up leftovers. And because everything cooks in the same pot, it's really nutritious. All those vitamins that cook out go into the broth, and so you don't lose anything. Okay. I probably have slightly more than 4 cups of onion here, but I don't need onions for a while. I don't think anything on this week's menu has onion in it, so I kind of just threw the extra half cup or so in. Okay. I'm not aggressively stirring. You see how they're starting to cook? Translucent. Now there's a term for you. Okay, so right now they're white, they're opaque. You can't see through them. Transparent is perfectly clear, like your window. Translucent is that glass you can't quite see through, but you know there's something on the other side and you can make out the shape and the colors. So that's how we're wanting to cook our onions. And as the onion cooks down, it mellows. So what I'm doing right now is I'm building flavor. It may seem boring to some, it may even seem tedious, but I'm cooking that sharp flavor out of the onion. It's getting mellow, it's blending with the butter, and it's going to build into this amazing flavor in that French onion soup. Again, I'm just nice medium heat, nothing's browning. You can really see them cooking down. Okay, and you want to make sure when you slice your onions, you stay as uniform as possible. That'll help them all cook down evenly at the same time. I've got a few pieces that are a little big. Took a little adjustment on my microplane. It's not microplane. What is it? Mandolin. Why do I keep calling it a microplane today? But on my mandolin to get it all sliced down thinly. So a couple of them are a little thicker. Okay, so these are at the point where you start thinking they're done. Because they are tender, some of them are starting to get translucent. We need to go just a little longer. Don't give up here. We're building that flavor. We want to keep going just a little longer. And I really don't like that. Alright, so these have cooked down really well. They are translucent. Oh. So, we are ready to add 48 ounces of beef broth. It's gonna steam up, it's gonna spatter. I generally turn my heat down to low while I do this. That can kind of help it from steaming and spattering. There we go. You can use whatever beef broth works for you. I usually use a low sodium beef broth. This time I'm using a full sodium beef broth, so I'm going to be really careful about adding anything with salt. To this, we are going to add, what the recipe calls for is 3 tablespoons of dry sherry. Okay, you can use regular sherry, you can use cooking sherry, or, since we're a high school group, we would use orange juice. It just gives us a little dimension to the flavor, and the orange juice typically works fairly well as a substitute for sherry. It's your choice. But we'll add that. Give it a little stir. I'm going to bring my heat back up to medium-low. Give it a stir. And then I'm going to add a teaspoon of dried thyme. Gives it a wonderful flavor. When you're using dried herbs, add them a little earlier in your soup, more towards the beginning of cooking. Fresh herbs will be at the end. And the last thing I am going to add to this is some pepper. I'm going to let it cook a little bit. Then I'll try it and see if it needs more salt. If you use a cooking sherry, remember that is salted pretty heavily. You want to be careful about adding any additional salt. I imagine I will end up adding salt to it, but since I'm used to low sodium beef broth, I want to be careful. Okay, so this is going to simmer for about 30 minutes. Now the recipe doesn't say whether or not to cover. I usually take and put a lid on it just to kind of keep anything from falling into it. But I tilt it a little so that steam can escape. And we're just going to let it simmer for half an hour. While it's simmering, I'm going to get my bread and cheese ready, so I'll be back. Alright, for the bread portion, I've taken a small loaf of French bread and I have sliced it, probably an 1.5 1.25 inches thick. And I'm going to toast this in my broiler. And I like to toast it first, then I'll flip it over and add the cheese. I feel it takes it just a little bit longer to absorb the broth and I get a little bit better texture. My soup, as you can see, is simmering away. It's got about 10 minutes left to cook. And it is doing beautifully. I'm going to turn it down just a little. Now, the broiler, if you remember from class, cooks really quickly. It's a high heat. I'm using a gas oven. So there is a flame that is literally running down the center of the inside of the top of my oven this way. And so it will cook it really quickly, and I need to kind of keep my eyes on it so that I don't burn it. So I do want to keep my oven just a little bit ajar. Alright, so my bread is beginning to toast. I am going to pull it out. Some of it's toasted more than others. That has to do with the location of the flame. I'm going to grab a pair of tongs here. And I'm going to turn it over. The other side is completely untoasted because it was not exposed to the heat. Those little ends off the bread. Alright. Now I'm going to add some provolone cheese. The recipe may call for provolone or Swiss, depends on the recipe you are using. Swiss is a bit more traditional. I started using provolone because a lot of my students will not eat something with Swiss cheese. So now again, you could put the bread in a bowl, lay the cheese over top, ladle the soup in there underneath it, and bake it in the oven. If you look up French onion soup, you'll see a lot of pictures. I don't have bowls that will work well for that, and some of you may not have that at home, so I didn't want to make that an expectation. Okay. So this is just another way you can do it if you don't have those resources. Alright, so we're just going to keep an eye on that bread. As the cheese melts, it's going to get a little bubbly. Okay, and I do leave my door open when I broil. Most of you know that. So I can see what's going on, and because it keeps that broiler running nice and engaged. At least that's what I've always been told. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. But that's what I've just always been told. So I'm watching that cheese melt. It's going to melt. It's going to start to bubble. And then it's going to get a little golden. That's what I'm looking for. I want golden, bubbly cheese. You know, think of a pizza. especially frozen pizza for some reason. And it's in there, and that cheese is bubbling, and it's turning brown. That's kind of what we're looking for here. Okay, and some of these edge pieces may not want to cook up as well because they're so far over. So I'm just going to give them a little push. Trust me, they'll separate. Got my grill tongs here. Okay, the back is cooking more than the front. And we saw that earlier too, so that tells us these are going to need a rotation. See that? That's what I'm wanting to see. Just a tiny bit more brown. I'll get down here. Y'all laughed at me when I told you gotta get down there and assume the broiling position here. Push my soup back. But I don't want this to burn, so I gotta get down and really watch it. Alright, we're gonna go with that. So nice cheesy bread. Alright, so there's where we are. We have our cheesy bread and we have our soup. I'll be back in a minute with plating. Alright, so I told you I'd show you how I plate this when you don't bake the soup with the bread in the bowl. Okay, so I take a ladle full of soup. Okay, then you can take a slice of bread. Go grab my tongs. Those are a bit toasty. And I just float it right in the middle. Okay, and then you can use your spoon to cut into that bread after it sops up a bit of that broth. And enjoy.